to recap part one, what is the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead? First of all, he prophesied many times. And for example, in Matthew 12:32, it's 12:40. Jesus said, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And again, in Matthew 16:21, he said, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the 3rd day he must be raised to life." So we have Jesus prophesied this many times. Secondly, the resurrection of the Messiah also fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Psalms 16:10 said, "For you shall not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." So there is Old Testament concerning the Messiah, prophecy that he would raise from the dead. Third, the resurrection is historical. The resurrection of Jesus was recorded by secular historians as well as biblical writers. For example, Josephus, the famous, he was Jewish, but he wrote for the Romans, and he was a well-known historian. And let me recount briefly what Josephus said. "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many Jews, and also many of the Greeks. This man was the Christ. And when Pilate condemned him to the cross, upon his impeachment by the principal men among us, those who had loved him from the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive on the 3rd day. The divine prophets having spoken these and thousands of other wonderful things about him, and even now the race of Christians so named for him has not died out." Now 30 AD was the year that Jesus died. Now this is in and of itself some evidence. It wasn't long ago. It was 30 AD. It wasn't just any time. It was the Friday before the Sabbath. So it was also a definite time. 30 AD was the year of crucifixion. Other writers, in addition to Josephus, Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, who lived from 50 AD to 115, wrote, "He, Jesus, was crucified and died under Pontius Pilate. He really, and not remotely in appearance, was crucified and died in the sight of beings in heaven and on earth." Also, Clement of Rome, writing in AD 95, that was 65 years later, he wrote that Jesus rose from the dead. 65 years. Now that would be like today, someone writing about the Korean War. Anybody here remember the Korean War? Okay, could we write about that? Yes, we could. Or it could be about Paul Carlson's junior high school graduation. That's about 65 years ago, right? Polycarp, another one of the church fathers, in 110 AD, wrote about the resurrection. Justin Martyr, the man from whom the term martyr was derived, he wrote a treatise testifying to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Plus, in addition to these witnesses, we have all 4 gospel writers. We have the letters of Paul. Those are written in AD 55 to 58. That's just 25 to 30 years after the act. We also have Dr. Luke, who is a very good historian, wrote the Acts of the Apostles, and he wrote carefully, researched carefully, between AD 63 and AD 70. Now, again, last week we covered Jesus really died. He was not in a coma. And we covered last week that Pilate required proof before he would release the body to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And that's recorded in Mark 15:44. Also, medical evidence. There were several articles written over the years. One of the best was on the evidence for the resurrection, the physical cause of death of Christ. Also, in 1986, the modern day, when most of the modern medical devices we have were available, there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association concerning the death of Jesus Christ. And the available evidence, and I won't take you through all this now, is that it was a rupture of the heart, is what Jesus died of. Also, very good book I recommend to you. Josh McDowell wrote The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now, again, last week, another element of evidence is Jesus was prepared for burial by devout Jews, by Nicodemus, and it was Nicodemus who John 3:16 was said to him, and also to Joseph of Arimathea. Both of those men were members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. They prepared him for death, and I think it's a safe assumption that good devout Jewish men don't bury people who are still alive. Also, the burial was witnessed. That's recorded in Mark 15:47, also Luke 23:56. Also, the tomb was empty. When they got into the tomb, there was no body. The body of Jesus was never produced. Now, that's what we covered last week. Let's start again and finish it off today. Question: was the body stolen? Some people say, well, Jesus' body, it was stolen. Okay, who stole it? Was it Caiaphas? Well, Caiaphas was the crooked high priest. He was Annas' son-in-law. He was another crooked high priest. And Caiaphas had already prophesied that it was good that one man should die to save the Jewish people. And actually, he was the one, he knew this prophecy. It wasn't a secret. In Matthew 27, 62 to 66, it talked about Caiaphas going to Pilate. And St. Matthew records, now, on the next day, which is the one after the preparation, the chief priests, Caiaphas, the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. Pilate was the Roman governor, and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, he being Jesus, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days, I will rise again.' Therefore, give orders that the grave be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come and steal him away, and say to the people, 'He's risen from the dead.' And that last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you can." And they went and made the grave secure. Along with the guard, they set a seal. Okay, well, first of all, there's a little translation dispute over "you have a guard." Did that mean you've got the temple guard, use the temple guard to do that? Or did it mean you take Roman guards and they will do it? And scholars battle about this. Some champion each. Probably it's a Roman guard, because for one thing, The Romans ruled the world at that time, and they ruled Jerusalem. They allowed the Jews to have temple guards inside the temple, but they probably didn't want temple guards outside the temple, exercising authority in the street. Okay, and let's look at Matthew 27. Oh, okay. I think we did read that. Okay. It's generally assumed that the guard was Roman, that sort of the weight of authority, even though there's a split, because, that's right, the Romans wouldn't have wanted the Jewish temple guard to be exercising authorities off the temple ground. And also there was a reference to custodia as a name for the guard. That's Latin. Also there was a reference to captain. Captain was a Roman rank. Now the military discipline of the Romans was famous. The Romans ruled the world at that time. They had state-of-the-art equipment, state-of-the-art weapons, state-of-the-art discipline. The various sources report that the penalty for a Roman soldier having a faulty night watch was one of two things. Either they ran a gauntlet of cudgels, clubs, or death. So the likelihood that Roman guards really slept is not very likely. How many guards? Some writers think there were as many as 30 guards. McDowell wrote that usually there would be 4 soldiers in a Roman guard. 1 or 2 would be keeping watch, and 1 or 2 could be sleeping or otherwise, attending to their needs. But the Roman guards were, first class, top of the line guys, and they were not likely to be overrun. There was also a citadel. There was a Roman citadel there. They could have gotten reinforcements. Secondly, there was a stone. What kind of a stone? Well, it was a great stone. The St. Mark called it exceedingly great. St. Matthew called it a great stone. St. Peter said, and these are all in the New Testament, for the stone was great. In any event, the stone was big enough that when the women, Mary Magdalene and whoever was with her, went to the tomb, they wondered, who's going to move this for us? This was not a stone that they could have moved themselves. Also, there was a seal. Caiaphas, he did not want this story or this prophecy of Jesus rising from the dead to come true, and he didn't want anybody to say that it was true, regardless. And so, by so doing, he said, we want a seal. Well, bless him. By giving us a seal, that sort of makes the proof even better. A seal probably would have been a cord that would be stretched around the stone and would be cemented maybe with clay at either side. And it was against the law of the Romans to break a seal. Now, did the disciples steal the body? As the British would say, not bloody likely. They were depressed. They were rejected. They were afraid. Now, all they had to do to steal Jesus' body was organize a raid that would overcome Roman soldiers, break a seal, roll away a huge stone, carefully unwrap Jesus' body, and leave the linen and napkin carefully to the side, then carry away Jesus' body to some other place where it could not be found, and don't leave a trail, and not only overcome the Roman guard that was there, but stop the Roman guard from calling out and rousing the other soldiers in the garrison. I submit to you that, in view of the objective evidence, the apostles, at least at that point in time, did not have the attitude, they didn't have the courage, they didn't have the know-how, and they didn't have the physical ability. So, what we're left with is, Jesus rose from the dead by his power, through his Father. Thank you for the contribution. Our brother over here pointed out to me last week that it was the Father who exercised the power, and thank you, I think that's right. Jehovah God, the Almighty Creator. Now, what other evidence is there? Well, how about post-resurrection appearances? He went on tour. Jesus appeared after the resurrection first to Mary Magdalene. Check Mark 16:9, John 20:14. He also appeared to women who were returning from the tomb. Matthew 28:9 and 10. He appeared to Peter, and later on Resurrection Sunday, or later that day on Resurrection Sunday, then he appeared to Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus. That's in Luke 24:13 to 33. Then he appeared to the apostles without Thomas. That's Luke 24:36-42 and John 20:19 through 24. Then he appeared to the apostles with Thomas present. And Thomas, you know, you got to walk in somebody's shoes, but it's amazing to me with the number of prophecies that he was going to rise again, that the apostles didn't get it. Thomas obviously didn't get it. He wanted to put his finger in the hand, put his hand in the side. And he did believe, but not until then. Next, John 21:1 through 23 records Jesus appearing to the seven by Lake Tiberias. Then, Apostle Paul, again, the Apostle Paul wrote before the Gospels. The letters of Paul were the earliest Christian writings, that the Gospels came after. And the Apostle Paul wrote that Jesus appeared to a multitude of 500 plus believers. Also, in Corinthians, it's recorded that Jesus appeared to James. He also appeared to the 11, Matthew 28:16 through 20, Mark 16:14 through 20, another reference in Luke, and also in Acts. Also, he appeared to people at the time of his ascension. Now, there were also appearances, not quite the same maybe, to the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, to Stephen as he was being stoned, to Paul in the temple. Now, we have multiple eyewitnesses. Multiple eyewitnesses. You know, in old Jewish law, you weren't allowed to condemn anybody to death unless there were two witnesses. One might be mistaken, one might be bribed, but two were considered to be sufficiently reliable to base a sentence of death on it. Well, in Jesus' case, we had hundreds. And the significance is, and I'm now quoting C.S. Lewis, who was a professor at Oxford, very smart guy. He said, "The first fact in the history of Christendom is the number of people who say they have seen the resurrection. If they had died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no gospels would have ever been written." Now, another observation made by a fellow named Montgomery was that in 56 AD, Paul wrote that over 500 people had seen the risen Jesus, and most of them were still alive. This passes the test of credibility. Another thing that's amazing is, and this is from McDowell, the character of the witnesses. These weren't crooks and drug addicts who were willing to say anything for a fix. The character of the early Christians was the highest order of ethical teaching ever known. Even the testimony of the enemies of the early Christians were that they lived their very, very high ethical standards. They died, some of them martyrs' deaths, rather than refute the testimony that Jesus rose from the dead. And so what we have here is a large group of witnesses who all testified to the same thing. And some of them were even willing to die for it. That is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, and people really saw it. Another sort of left-hand bit of proof, but let's mention it here. None of the enemies of the way, and you know, Jesus had enemies, the church had enemies, none of them ever disproved the resurrection. If any of them could have found the body of the deceased Jesus and said, ha-ha, these guys are four-fleshers, it didn't happen, as much as other people would have liked. And to me, the strongest evidence is the changes in the lives of the apostles. What did they act like? You know, before the crucifixion, when the mob came out to seize Jesus, did they stand and fight? No, they ran. And they scattered. But after he rose, after they saw their leader rose from the dead, they were the strongest force in history. And they changed the whole world from a small handful of, well, let me read the words of a Harvard lawyer named Simon Greenleaf. He said about the disciples, "It was therefore impossible that they could have persisted in affirming the truths that they have narrated had not Jesus actually risen from the dead, and had they not known this fact as certainly as they knew any other fact. The annals of military warfare afford scarcely an example of the like heroic constancy, patience, and unflinching courage. They had every possible motive to review carefully the grounds of their faith and the evidences of the great facts and truths they asserted." Let's talk about other evidence. I mean, it's abundant. James, how many here? Well, there was more than one James. I'm talking about James, the half-brother of the Lord. Now, how many here have ever heard of Scientology? Okay, it's a fake. It's a fraud. And one of the reasons that I think it's a fake and a fraud is I read a book that was written by the son of L. Ron Hubbard. The son of L. Ron Hubbard debunked his father's pseudo-church. In contrast, James, the half-brother of Jesus, and some sources suggest that James was not much of a believer while Jesus was alive. After the resurrection, James, the half-brother of Christ, became one of the pillars of the church. I think he was called Old Camel Knees because he was down on his knees praying so much. Let's see. Also, the existence of this church, the existence of the Christian church in the world. The church is a fact of history. The explanation for the existence of the church is its faith in the resurrection. Throughout the early years, this institution suffered a lot of persecution from the Jews, from the Romans. Individuals suffered torture and death for their Lord only because they knew he had risen from the grave. A writer named H.D.A. Major wrote, "Had the crucifixion of Jesus ended his life, his disciples' experience of him, it is hard to see how the Christian church would have come into existence. The church was founded on faith in the messiahship of Jesus. It was the resurrection, as St. Paul declares in Romans 1:4, which proclaimed him to be the Son of God with power." Also, Sunday worship. The Jews worshiped on the Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday. The Christian church worships on Sunday. Why? The reason is because Jesus rose on Sunday. And that is why, commemorating the resurrection, we worship on Sundays. I always used to have trouble with this because of that. Was it really 3 days? And it was. And here's why. Days begin at sunset for Jews. And so Jesus died on the cross on Friday. So he was dead on that day. That's 1 day. Saturday was the 2nd day. And then Sunday was the 3rd day. So he did rose on the 3rd day. Now, the last element of proof that we'll cover today is baptism. Baptism is a Christian ritual. In baptism, as we understand it, we are buried under the water with our Lord, and then we are raised with him. The symbol of resurrection is again present. Jews continued to practice circumcision. Christians continued to practice the Lord's command concerning baptism. A person was called to repent of his or her sins, believe in the risen Lord, and be baptized. What did baptism symbolize? There's no doubt. Baptism is a believer who is united to Christ in his death and his resurrection. When he enters the water, he dies to his old sin nature. When he rises out of the water, he shares a new resurrected life in Christ. There is nothing in Christianity older than the sacraments. And if they are directly linked to the death and resurrection of Christ, they are yet another proof. Things of the Spirit we know by the Spirit. But in my own personal life, there was a time when the combination of all of the facts that we've just discussed convinced me that the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. If that's so, then he must have been who he said he was, the Son of God, the Messiah, who came to save the Jews first and also the Greeks, which includes us. I think we're probably all baptized believers here, so it may be pointless to issue an invitation, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my faith and some of the reasons why I do believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Okay, Joe.